that anyone might have on previous lessons? Any questions? Hold on, there's a chat already starting. Let's check out the chat. Thank you, George. Okay, no questions. Great. As I always joke, I'm such a great teacher that nobody has any questions at the end of a seminar. Okay. All right, so why don't we begin? Let me share the screen and we'll get right to it. So tonight we're going to be discussing the continuing process of understanding Judaism and life after life. Everyone says life after death, but actually there's a growing rabbinic attitude. Don't use that term, life after death. It's life after living. So as in the first seminar and the second seminar, we showed Judaism's attitude towards the eternal soul within each person. And then we started talking about reincarnation. If you remember, the eternal soul concept was basically in our own prayer system, davening, the first thing you say is Modani lefanecha, thank you, God. Every morning when you wake up, Modani lefanecha, thank you, God, for returning my soul into my body. And the concept is that we acknowledge that we have a physical body and inside is a soul. And when we sleep, our soul migrates out of our body because we're not conscious. Our soul has nothing to do with, if I can use the colloquial term, and I often do, our soul gets bored. There's nothing to do. So it leaves our body, as the French refer to as la petite mort. Sleep is the little death. And our souls migrate to other places while we are sleeping. And that's why dream interpretation is so important in Judaism, because dreams occur to the neshama, to our souls, when it leaves the physical limitations of our body and has the ability to perceive the supernatural. And if you remember, there's only 2 times a year that you're allowed to fast on Shabbat. If Yom Kippur coincides with Shabbat, you have to fast. And there's a tradition, if you had an evil dream, you're supposed to fast. So if Friday night you had an evil dream, you're allowed to fast on Yom Kippur. You're allowed to fast on Shabbat if Friday night you had an evil dream, because dreams are taken very seriously in Judaism and the mystical tradition, because our souls are revealed to our souls. Dreams are revealed to our souls when we're in a higher plane of existence. So that being said, that also there's many other brachot. If you remember, he said, Eloheinu shamash natati li, oh God, the soul that you created is pure. You placed it in me. And this is the second paragraph I recite after Modeh. And it says, and God, you gave it to me. You will take it from me, and then you'll return it to me in the world to come. This is all in the prayer book. And these tefillot were established by Anshe Knesset HaGadol, the members of the Great Assembly, about 2,500 years ago, 2,350 for sure, as long as 2,400 years ago. So that means 400 years before Jesus ever was alive, and an additional, it's 500 years before the Nicene Conference, where Christianity incorporated the ideas of the supernatural into Christianity, life after life and the resurrection. So 500 years before Christianity, we already had these concepts. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is because what we're learning here tonight has nothing to do, excuse me, let me just mute for a second. Sorry, there was some noise out on the street. So all these ideas that we're going to be sharing, oh, Rabbi, we were influenced by Christianity. No, just the opposite. Christianity was influenced by us. And what we were talking about here is preceding Christianity by at least 350 years and even as much as 500 years. So let's get to reincarnation. So again, in the concept of believing in life after death, Maimonides, and forgive me if you've been participating in all series, I know we're going to go a little fast, but even Maimonides, who was an Aristotelian, he believed in Aristotle's attitude of logic and science and rational thought. He believed yet in the resurrection of the dead, which literally means to him that our souls exist, and upon death they resurrect, they leave our body, and they are lifted up out of, so to speak, Sheol, out of the grave, and that we continue to live after we die. And even though Maimonides, Rambam, was a scientist, a physician, he definitively had a belief that our souls live inside our bodies and that they continue to live after we pass away. And it is the 13th principle of the Shlosha Ikarim. Rabbi Josh is continuing in his class. He started this months ago, and he continues to study this particular subject matter, the 13 principles of faith, if you want to ever join his classes. The next thing regarding reincarnation, what you see on the right is actually a 15th century, not shortly after the invention of the 16th century, shortly after the invention of the printing press, one of the first books ever printed Jewishly was Sefer HaZohar, the book of mystical teachings known as the Zohar. And that, what you see there is actually the wood carving front page of Sefer HaZohar, the book of Zohar. And what does it say in the book of Zohar regarding Gilgul, or reincarnation? By the way, Gilgul comes from the Hebrew word meaning referencing a wheel, a circle, and that life is a circle. You're here, then you die, and then you come back. That it's a process, a cycle. So what does it say in the Zohar? It says, "Pada nafsho me'avar b'shachat v'chayato bo'or tireh, hein kol ela yifal el pamayim shalosh im daber." Behold, all these things does God do twice, even 3 times with a man, to bring his soul back from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of the living. That's from the book of Job. And commentating on it, as long as a person is unsuccessful, the Zohar explains on this verse, in his purpose in this world, the Holy One, blessed be he, uproots him and replants him over and over again. This is the Zohar's explanation of what Job said. And if you remember, why is this so important? Because reincarnation, the source material that we use right here is from the book of Job, because that classic question about what happened to Job. Job, as we all remember, was a victim of a debate between God and Satan. Satan said, of course, Job is righteous, he's wealthy, he's healthy, he has many children. So God said, no, Job is a good man, and that's why he's good. It has nothing to do with those things. And to prove it, Satan was permitted to come down and take away all of Job's wealth. And then he was still righteous, and he was allowed to come down and take away all of Job's health. And then finally, he was still righteous. And then finally, he was permitted to come in and take away, that means to kill, as using a euphemism, Job's 10 children. So the rabbis asked the question, wait a minute, 10 children died because God wanted to prove something to Job, wanted to prove how holy Job was by punishing him? That's ridiculous. So the rabbis encapsulated a lot of the concept of Gilgul, reincarnation. Well, those were souls that needed to be reincarnated, and that they were actually used to prove, use the concept of Gilgul that we're about to go over, that this is all to make purge of evil from a soul, or to rectify a soul. So let's continue real quickly with Gilgul. Let's just read the blue. Resurrection is a time of reward. Reincarnation is a time of repairing. Resurrection is a time of reaping. Reincarnation is a time of sowing. So the idea is that reincarnation is when a soul is imperfect and wants to perfect or correct or do a tikkun or fix something. That's when reincarnation occurs. Resurrection is part of a reward system of living a righteous life. And when the Mashiach comes, that physical resurrection. I just wanted to share here the historical, literally the last 1800 years, rabbis that believed in reincarnation, that it wasn't a minority school of thought, that it was absolutely pervasive throughout Rabbinic Judaism, Gaonic Judaism, Talmudic Judaism. So for example, you've got Nachmanides, Rabbeinu Bachya, Rabbi Levin Ibn Habib, Solomon Alkabetz of Tzfat, Isaac Luria. So here you have like the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon. That's one I emphasize, because Vilna Gaon was known as a literalist, Litvisha. You know, he was a rational rabbi that was known for his Talmudic expertise. But throughout his Talmudic writings, whenever it became apparent that Gilgul was involved, he elucidated on Gilgul, on reincarnation. So here you had a classic, you know, trained, so to speak, authoritative rabbinic source that absolutely was not known for his mystical traditions, but talked at length about reincarnation when it was appropriate in Talmudic or biblical sense. Of course, what we would consider more modernist, HaChacham Yosef Chaim, also known as the Ben Ishai, he lived in the 1800s, Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag in the 1900s, the Babi Sala passed away, I believe, at the turn of the millennia. I think he passed away in 2003 or something like that. And he was one of the most famous of the last of the classic Mekubalim in Israel. In the Sefer Bahir, and this is again what you have here on the right, you have a picture of Vilna. And again, this is why I particularly placed this photo here. Vilna was known for its classical yeshivas, you know, the Vilna Gaon and the Vilna Yeshiva, you know, the Litvish world. But here, of all the places to have a mystical work published in 1853, was in Vilna. You know, I would understand why it might be published in Sfat or maybe in, you know, Lubov, you know, because of the Lubavitchers or, you know, or Berdichev. No, it was published in Vilna, even though it was what we would classically think inconsistent with the Jewish community of Vilna. So let's real quickly go over what it talked about in Sefer Bahir. It questions why does, the classic discussion is, why do righteous people suffer and evil people appear to prosper? So let's read this real quickly from Sefer Bahir. Why is there a righteous person to whom good things happen while another righteous person has bad thing happens to him? This is because the righteous person did bad in a previous life and is now experiencing the consequences? Question mark. What is this like? A person planted a vineyard and hoped to grow grapes, but instead sour grapes grew. He saw that his planting and harvest were not successful, so he tore it out. He cleaned out the sour grapevines and planted again. When he saw that this planting was not successful, he tore it up and planted it again. The idea is that you keep on coming back until you get proper good grapes. In the Sefer Bahir, it contradicts the what was written in the book of Job that said 2 or 3 times we're reincarnated. In the Sefer Bahir, it can continue for 1,000 generations. But the common opinion in the Spanish traditions is that in order to atone for one's sin, the soul transmigrates 3 or more times after entering its original body. And that's again based on the book of Job. In Lurianic mysticism, you know, the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, also known as the Arizal. Arizal stands for, it's an abbreviation of the Ashkenazi Rabbi Isaac of blessed memory. We call him the Arizal, Zal, Zichrono Livracha. So this is what he discusses. The idea of transmigration of a soul as a punishment was discussed throughout the Gaonic period. This included the concept that souls can be embedded into animals, plants, and even inorganic or inanimate matter. Yeah, you know, classical Gilgul is a person being a soul being reinlivened into another human body. And Lurianic mysticism says no, it can be into a plant, into an animal, into a rock. That's what the Arizal taught. The opinion did not become common until after the 1400s. Transmigration into the bodies of animals is first mentioned in Sefer HaTmuna, which originated with the Kabbalists of Girona, Spain. You heard me mention earlier the Spanish Mekubalim as compared to the Ashkenazi Hasidic Mekubalim. Sefer HaGilgulim, Sha'ar HaGilgulim, which means the gates of reincarnation, is attributed to the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria. And his foremost disciple, Rabbi Chaim Vital, and his son, Rabbi Shmuel Vital, expounded on this concept that third great Rabbi Yitzchak Luria began. Adam Harishon, the first soul, the first person, had neshama klalit, the one and only soul. And when he sinned, that vessel was broken, and it shattered into thousands upon thousands of fragments. And those soul fragments shattered into other thousands and thousands of fragments. And they refer to as yitzitze or, which means sparks of light. And what happened was, although there was one primordial soul in Adam HaKadmon, the primordial man, that when he committed his sin, along with his wife Eve, that their souls fragmented and became all the souls that we have today. So since all souls are part of the original form, they can reunite and separate at will or at need. So there are many different allegorical, what's the correct term? Symbolic explanations. It's sort of, I prefer the concept of water, a drop of water, that there is one original vessel of water. And if you take a drop of water out, the water can return and it becomes part of the whole again. So that's what the souls are when we pass away. Our souls reunite into the general neshama klalit, and when necessary, that one drop can be brought back and put back and in and out as necessary to do a tikkun, that which needs to be fixed. I think we have a chat or maybe a question. Let me just check. Okay. Very good. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. There's another chat. Let's see, before I go on. Let's see. Question is directed from Steve. When the Mashiach comes, will we have been reincarnated? And if so, would this soul have been here multiple times before, but just not at the right, sorry, I lost it, at the right time? Alternatively, once the Mashiach comes, is he then immortal, or does he die and can be reincarnated again? So reincarnation is separate from Chiyat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead. And there's, by the way, you should know there are many different rabbis that hold different conceptual understandings of what resurrection of the dead. So let's just for a moment, and it is going to be a whole night of study what the resurrection of the dead literally means in classical Jewish text. But to understand it in its very, very simplest form tonight, basically, the classic understanding is that there's going to be a time when the Messiah comes, and part of the Messianic era, how do you know that the Messiah is the Messiah? Because there's going to be a number of amazing occurrences. The most classic one is discussed in the book of Isaiah, and a lion will lie down with a sheep, and a child will be able to sit at the den of an asp. An asp is like a rattlesnake, and they dig holes into the ground. A child, basically, there'll be no more pain and suffering. There'll be no more killing. It'll be a time of utopian peace, the Garden of Eden. And one of those factors is resurrection of the dead. And the purpose of the resurrection of the dead is so that Mashiach, the Messiah, will also be a general, a military leader. He will lead a war between Gog and Magog, the forces of good and evil, and that the resurrected dead will fight in that battle along with the last generation that is alive, the current generation that is alive. Now, that being said, I have to tell you that there are plenty of rabbis who do not accept that classical definition of resurrection of the dead. And the reason is, if you act good in this world, you are rewarded with Olam Haba. You are rewarded with going to a higher plane of existence. You want to call it the Garden of Eden? Do you want to call it heaven? You know what? Let's just call it heaven. Okay? So you do good in this world. You don't have to fix anything. You get rewarded. You get graduated up into heaven. and then the Mashiach comes, you're punished and you're brought back into your body. That's like graduating in college and being forced to go back into high school, or worse, going back into elementary school. Wait a minute. I already went through a high school. I don't want to do pimples and dating all over again. I don't want to do that, right? So the idea is that there are plenty of rabbis who do not accept that classic definition of resurrection of the dead. So that was a good question. And again, I always encourage you to ask them. And I'd rather not continue with more until everyone is on the same page and understanding where we are at this point. So let's continue. About the Lurianic mysticism and the concept of being reincarnated into alternative, non-human. Let me see, why did that happen? Sorry, for some reason it stopped sharing. Okay, here we go. So the Or HaChaim HaKodesh, Rabbeinu Chaim ben Ater, spoke at length about this rabbinic concept started by the Rizal, that you can be reincarnated into a rock, into a plant, or even into an animal. The initial generations after Adam lived hundreds of years. As generations' lifespans diminished, they had less time to correct sins and mistakes of their lives. When they then did not utilize their long lives for this purpose, tikkun, the need and prevalence of or reincarnation increased. Which, if you think about it, the Or HaChaim is very logical. Adam, sinned on the first day of his life. He died at the age of 930. He had 930 years to say, I'm sorry. He had 930 years to correct that horrible sin. So if he's not going to be reincarnated, we understand why, because he fixed it. He did tshuva. Or Abraham lived to the age of 175. Or Isaac lived to the age of 180. Or Jacob lived to the age of 148. Whatever it is, we see that they lived extremely long lives. And upon having such extensive lives, that gave them plenty of time to do tikkun. However, as lives slowly shorten, 70, 80, 90 years if we're lucky, we may not have enough time to do a tikkun. And that's why the Or HaChaim, based on the teachings of Arizal, explains that reincarnation is a much more prevalent thing in the last years. Does the Dalai Lama fit into any of this? There's an interesting phenomenon about the Dalai Lama. He has I might be overstating it, but the Dalai Lama has an amazing love affair with Judaism. And in fact, there was a book written, I believe it was in the 1990s, called The Jew and the Lotus. And the Dalai Lama invited a group of rabbis, theologians, writers, philosophers to join him in Tibet. And amongst them was Yitz Greenberg. And they wrote a book about this trip. Basically, the Dalai Lama wanted to study with the rabbis. And he studied Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, but one of the most interesting things that he wanted a lot of discussion on, and he still has opportunities to meet with rabbis. One of the interesting things about the Dalai Lama is he wanted to know how we survived and thrived 2,000 years of a diaspora, being kicked out of our country. So why is that so important to the Dalai Lama? Because his community of Buddhism was kicked out of Nepal by the Chinese. So they're in a diaspora now. He's not allowed to go home. So he wanted to learn from us how we successfully thrive after being kicked out of our homeland. So let's move on with, that was to answer that question about the Dalai Lama. By the way, you should know when I was in Yeshiva University, one of the graduate students presented a paper, and I actually found it so interesting. I saw the premise, and I attended his lecture where he presented his doctoral thesis. Basically, he showed the amazing correlation between Jewish mysticism and Far Eastern mysticism. Not so. For example, there are 10 sfirot. There are 10 filters that that allow God's energy into this world. Think about it as the sun being so hot that if you go out into the sun, you'll, on a, in the Sahara Desert in August, you'll burn to a crisp in a matter of minutes. So you have to put on SPDF 50, and you have to put on sun blocking shirt, and then you have to wear a veil, and you have to wear sunglasses. So what happens is there are 10 sfirot, which are filters that protect us from the extreme energy that emanates from God, from the Ein Sof. And each one of those filters has a name. There's Chachma, there's Bina, Dad, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Yisod, Hod, and Malchut. There are 10 of these emanations. So the idea is that that the process of reincarnation, that the Dalai Lama was very interested in Jewish mysticism, because in Far Eastern mysticism, there are also sfirot, except you know what they call them? Sapphira. I might be mispronouncing it, but the amazing thing is in many linguistic studies, there's a correlation between P and F. That's why PH is an F sound. In Hebrew, pei nefei is only a difference is a dot. So if you look at the amazing correlation between sfirot and sapphira, where again, I don't know how to pronounce it in Tibetan, but there's also not only in the terms, but the idea that I think they're actually 12. But in some forms of our own mysticism, there are also 12. But one of the most interesting things, maybe you're aware, but in the South Pacific, do you know how you say a tribal leader or spiritual leader in the South Pacific? They're called a kahuna, the big kahuna. If you ever watched one of those surfing movies of the 60s, they were surfing, the head surfer was called the big kahuna, and it's based on a Polynesian term. Isn't it amazing? One of his concepts was Kohen. A Kohen is the person that is the representative of the kahuna, which means the priesthood, and the remarkable similarity literally in the terms. So why would there be a similarity of terms linguistically? And the answer is that sounds elicit a spiritual response. For the same reason, in majority of languages, the word for mother all begins with M. And if you talk to people linguistics, they'll tell you that when an infant nurses and they start developing ability to elicit sounds, the nursing sound, the sucking sound is frequently closing of the lips for the purpose of nursing, latching on, and that the initial sounds that you make are M, the M sounds, and therefore the nursing is associated with the M sound, and that's why mom, mommy, ima, they're all M. These are words that are all associated, so that a sound elicits a spiritual or emotional response to them. And it's amazing how Far Eastern mysticism and classical Jewish mysticism have remarkably similar sounds that represent the same exact similar spiritual content. What really is amazing is that Far Eastern mysticism developed about 3,000 years ago, and Jewish mysticism, according to our tradition, simultaneously with Moshe Rabbeinu, if not even earlier. But there was no communication between Jewish mystics and Far Eastern mystics to explain the amazing correlation. There was no telephone calls, there was no satellite calls, there was no texting, there was no email. And yet, over approximately a 6,000-mile trek between them, and the Jews being in the Middle East and in Israel, and the Tibetans being in the high mountains, the highest mountains of the world, it's amazing how their correlation. By the way, you should also know that where's the mystical center of Israel? Tzfat, the highest mountains of Israel. And Tibetan mysticism is obviously Buddhist mysticism, Tibetan mysticism, the highest mountains of the world. So things that we can discuss at a later time. And good. So I still see there are no more questions. We can go on to the next point. So getting back to reincarnation in the Torah. Oh, wait, there is something, because I kind of left you, we're going to discuss it more. At this rate, I'm not sure if we're going to make it to what, but I don't want to leave it open-minded. So according to Lurianic mysticism and all the rabbis that taught Lurianic mysticism, what would be the purpose of being reincarnated into a rock, a plant, or an animal? So the example is, what happens if you denied, what happens if you denied the essence of God, and you said that God didn't create plant life, or if you ate trafe? So what happens is you'd be reincarnated into a kosher animal so that you could be ritually slaughtered and provide kosher meat for a person who believed in the importance of kosher meat. And then as that meat is being imbibed into a person, incorporated into that person metabolically, your energy that was in the animal is now in a person's body, and that is able to fulfill the mitzvah of keeping kosher. So you sin by not keeping kosher, you're reincarnated into an animal so that it could be ritually slaughtered kosher and eaten by a person at a kosher event. So that the purpose is that's how you would do a tikkun. When the same thing with a plant. Let's say, for example, you never observe the mitzvah of Havdalah. And one of the things of Havdalah is that you make a blessing on fragrant herbs. So you'd be reincarnated into cinnamon. And that the cinnamon would then make its way into a Jewish home, or a person would make a bracha on cinnamon. So that's how the Lurianic school of mysticism explains the tikkun, how you did a sin in a previous life. And they believed you can be even incorporated into a inanimate object like a rock. A rock? And the answer is, what happens if that rock is then used to build a synagogue, to build a hospital, well, then there's a tikkun. And the moment that the rock, you're reincarnated into that rock, as soon as that rock is incorporated into a mitzvah, the energy of your soul is released because you fulfilled that mitzvah. Okay, so reincarnation in the Torah. When the Jewish people worship the golden calf, God tells Moshe, and he's so angry with the nation that he plans to destroy them and start all over again with Moses. Okay, very famous. Moses prays to save the Jewish people and that God should forgive them. He says, this people has committed a grievous sin and made themselves a god of gold. And now if you would but forgive their sin, erase me, macheni na, from your book that you have written. So what's so interesting about macheni na? Moshe was, according to tradition, a Gilgul of Noach. Noach failed to pray on behalf of his generation. When God told him, I'm going to destroy the entire world and by a flood, he goes, okay, I'll build your ark. He didn't argue. He didn't try to save the people like Moshe Rabbeinu did. So when you take the words macheni na, erase me, it literally spells out Minoach ani, I am from Noach. And Noach didn't fight for people when he heard that they were going to be killed. Moshe Rabbeinu fights for the children of Israel. When he finds out they're going to be killed, he fights and he argues with God. And macheni na, I am from Noach. Then he fixed Noach because Noach had missed that opportunity to argue with God on the behalf of the condemned people. So that's an example. Let me show you one more, I believe. So here's one of my favorite. I don't think I discussed this. This should be new material to everyone. Yosef, Hatzadik, the righteous one, when he was an indentured servant to the minister of Egypt, Potiphar, he was offered sexual favors from the wife of his master, Potiphar. Okay, but he always declined. She was always trying to seduce him. He was 17 years old. He was really handsome. He was really smart. By the way, in the Hebrew, he was called Ceres. And a Ceres is a eunuch. To be able to gain access to Pharaoh 24 hours a day and pass through the harem, you had to become a eunuch. You had to be castrated. It's actually, even in the 1900s, when you became a minister to the King of China, you also, excuse me, the Emperor of China, you also had to become a eunuch. It's a known historical, unfortunate reality. So numerous times she tried to seduce him, and he never gave in. Upon his spiritual ascent, Yosef regretted not reprimanding the wife of Potiphar and not standing up for moral behavior. He just ran away. He should have yelled at her, should have reprimanded her. So how does this relate? Therefore, he was reincarnated into the body of Pinchas, and he was given the opportunity to fulfill this one mitzvah. And what happened in the story in Bamidbar, chapter 25, verses 6-8? Just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance at the tent of the meeting. When Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly and taking a spear in his hand. They were committing a lewd sexual act in public. He followed the Israelite man into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelite was checked. So the rabbis emphasized with one thrust, he killed both of them through the stomach. That's the literal text. Why? Because they were, I forget the term, is it? Maybe the attorneys in our midst will correct. What is it? Lectus delecti, or in the midst of the act. They were literally in public, laying in public, and this is a famous wood carving of Pinchas killing Zimri and Cosby with a spear from 1666. So the idea was that with one thrust of the spear, he was able to kill both of them. The rabbis explain is that they were in the midst of a sexual act at the same time in public, in open. And so that's how Yosef was reincarnated into Pinchas. So for that one moment that he would be able to fulfill that mitzvah of reprimanding sexual immorality. Okay, there's another question. Frank, you're such a scholar. You're right. When Yosef was the last time he was offered, it says Mamea. Because should I do it? Should I not do it? Should I do it? Should I not do it? And he finally said, no, I can't do it. Very good, Frank. Okay, so let's go to the next. Interesting thing, Moshe, there's a tradition that Moshe was reincarnated into the prophet Samuel. And how did that happen? Moshe fulfilled many roles as a leader. He judged the people, as in the story of Yitro and the grad. Remember, Yitro, his father-in-law, comes to him, and everyone was standing from morning till night to get to Moshe. They were standing in a long line because people had issues with one another, and he would judge the people from morning until night. And Yitro yells at him, reprimands him. You're killing yourself and you're killing the people. Make judges over tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. And it's a graduated court system, local court, an appellate court, a state court, regional court, and graduated, and everyone will be able to get their adjudication. So you see that primarily Moshe Rabbeinu was a judge. Second thing is he interpreted the law. People didn't understand the law, so he interpreted. And the third thing is he was definitely a general. He led the people of Israel, and he executed a man trying to kill a Jew. Remember that story? When he went out, before he became the famous Moshe, he left his Pharaoh's household, his adopted home, and he saw an Egyptian killing a Jew, threatening to a Jew, almost killing him, and Moshe Rabbeinu took his life. So if you look, Moshe Rabbeinu was reincarnated into Samuel, and he did the same thing. Samuel judged the people. In fact, in the book of Samuel, it says that he walked the length and the breadth of Israel, judging the people as he lived. He taught Israel the good way and the right way. That's book of Samuel, chapter 12, verse 23. He led Israel in battle against the Philistines. Samuel 3, chapter 3, verse 20. And then when Saul, the king of Israel, screwed up, he killed Agag. Saul let the king of the Amalekites stay alive. His name was Agag, and Samuel was very angry because Saul, the king of Israel, was ordered kill every Amalekite, and he let the king go. He let the king live, and says that Samuel put him to death with his own hands. So you see that what happened, everything that Moses did, Samuel did, with one exception. And what is that? Moshe had only one regret in his life: his inability to walk into the land of Israel. And then we learn, and Samuel judged Israel as long as he lived. And each year he made the rounds of Bethel, Gilgal, and Mitzpah, and acted as a judge over Israel in all those places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there too he would judge Israel. He built an altar there unto the Lord. So what is the one thing that Moshe Rabbeinu could not do? Enter into the land. And what did Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, do? The reincarnation of Samuel? It took him his entire life, but he went every single inch of the land of Israel. He did a circuit of concentric circles, making sure that he was able to walk the entire land of Israel. By the way, I want to apologize because I should have made the announcement that tonight's class is actually sponsored by Saul Serebnik and Rita Serebnik in memory of Leon Serebnik. So very important that I make that announcement, and I apologize for not making the announcement earlier. There is a chat question. Yes, correct, Frank. Once again, Moshe became the Supreme Court. He was the last way to you could appeal every decision all the way up to Moses. Correct. So you see that here, when we study this in Sefer Bahir, in the Sefer Shar HaGilgulim, all these concepts is that a soul was unfulfilled, a soul was incomplete, or a soul screwed up. He said, look, I know I can be in heaven, but I'd rather go back and do this one mitzvah. Please let me go back and fix this one thing one thing left on my bucket list. And that's why, according to this tradition, the soul comes back in the process of Gilgul. Let's see, I have a good 12 minutes left. Okay, various reasons for Gilgulim. And then this, by the way, you see this on your right, this is from Shar Kidduh HaTiru, and it is a manifestation of those 10 emanations of God. If you look closely, here you have Bina, here you have Gdula, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Yisod, Hod, Malchut. These are the 10 emanations of the Sphira coming out of the Ein Sof. This is like the sun, the prime energy of God, and the energy comes out and in different levels and different filters. And in this particular mystical work, they deliberately made it in the form of a wheel, Shar HaGilgulim, explaining that the energy of God can manifest itself in life as a series of wheels that you reincarnate at a different level so that you can fulfill that which you are lacking in a previous life. So I see, I'm not sure if everyone else is covering this, but I see some people are okay, let me see. Someone just sent me a personal text about the class. Please take out the opportunity. Oh, I see. You don't know how to chat. Okay, I understand. Okay, so the question is, could you come back more than once as a rock? And the answer is, I assume so. Personally, I know who am I to question the great Arizal, Lurianic mysticism, but I just don't see that process. My personal belief system is that we don't come back as a rock. But if we're going to accept, and who am I to question the great Arizal, I would be willing to to assure you that if for whatever reason your spiritual energy was not rectified in your first coming back as a rock, then you would become back a second and a third time as a rock. Again, my personal uh, understanding and what resonates with me is that you come back as human beings. So I'm going to accept the more medieval and less of the Hasidic and the Arizal attitude towards being reincarnated into a rock. This is from Steve, are all rabbinic views of past lives in agreement that when or if a soul enters another body, it does not bring with it any tangible memory of who or what it used to be? Can you just juxtapose that with a hypnosis and previous life experience, past life regression, bringing it memories, which some people say they have? And this is actually that we discussed last week. The most famous person who's done this is Dr. Brian Weiss. Dr. Brian Weiss was a local Miami psychiatrist who started using hypnosis, regressive hypnosis, to bring people back to periods of their life where he thought that if they have a phobia or a psychosis or a neuroses, that if he could only identify it by bringing a person back to that one point of their life to experience, for example, if he felt if you had a fear of drowning, well, if he could make you regress you hypnotically to a point where, at the age of 3, your father threw you in the pool to force you to learn how to swim. So he would regress you back to 30 years old, 20 years old, 10 years old, to 3 years old, and see if he could find that place where the neurosis was caused. And what happened was he accidentally found people that were accidentally regressing way beyond to previous lives, and that they were remembering things that there's no way, speaking in fluent French and Spanish and alternative languages, that there's no way that they could have experienced or knowledge. And knowledge of towns and cities and history that are only found in what he was able to clarify and validate in obscure history books. And he wrote a book called Many Lives, Many Masters, in which he documented it. Now, he was a classically trained psychiatrist who over a period of 10 years changed his attitude towards the supernatural based on the idea that he felt and wrote this book, Many Lives, Many Masters, basically explaining his concept that he now feels that there is not empirical proof, but anecdotal evidence that cannot be explained, how people can be regressed to previous lives and remember things of a regressed memory from a previous life. You should know that in the early 1960s, there was an Elui born. Elui means a genius, a child, a prodigy, that was born in B'nai Brak. And he started speaking at a normal age, like at 8 or 9 months, he started speaking Yiddish, and then Hebrew, and then German, and then Polish, with no way of learning this. And at the age of 4 or 5, they brought him to a rabbi, a Mekubal, and the Mekubal said, this is in the early 60s, that it took 20 years for him to be incarnated. He was a Holocaust victim that was reincarnated into this body. And as soon as he fulfills whatever goal it is, and for some reason, the child, the reincarnated body, remembered the past, certain aspects of its past life. You should know that the child lived a number of years and then died a natural death, but a young teenager. So that's a very famous story that the ultra-Orthodox do not use the family name because it was a painful situation for the family members. I will share with the class tonight something I have shared regarding this, a concept of Gilgul. I have a family member in Israel, not so distant, but a family member that I'm very close with, and was married to a man that had many issues. And they decided to go to this famous Mikubal in Jerusalem. And this famous Mikubal, a Kabbalist, sat them down and asked the man, the husband, to open up a Chumash. He handed him a Chumash, a Bible, and turned to a page. He turned to a page. And then he said, do it again. He did it again. And each time the rabbi, the Mikubal, noted what page he turned to. And then he looked at him and he said, you're a convert, aren't you? And they looked at each other, this husband and wife, because it's a family secret. Nobody knows that he was a convert. What happened was he said, yes, I am. He goes, yes. So let me tell you what your situation is. Your father survived Auschwitz, didn't he? He goes, Birkenau. And then he escaped. He goes, yes. And then he escaped the second time. He goes, you're right. He was recaptured and he was sent to another camp and he escaped from that camp. He goes, right. That your grandfather, however, perished in Birkenau. Because that's correct. My grandfather perished in Birkenau. And what happened was when your father came to America in 1947 or 49, he met a non-Jewish woman, your biological mother, and had a child with her. And your parents ended up divorced because they looked at each other because they didn't tell everyone this. Because what happened was your grandfather, as he was being led to being shot for a punishment, he said, I regret being born a Jew. I rue the day I was ever born. And when he died, Al Kiddush Hashem, he was forgiven because he died sanctifying God's name. But with his dying breath, he regret being born a Jew. Therefore, you are the reincarnation of your grandfather. And your grandfather said, what a horrible thing I did. Regret being born a Jew. So he said, you were born into a non-Jewish body so that you can rectify the failure of your grandfather by choosing to become Jewish. So you did a tikkun. So then why did you not die? And the answer is you still have things that you have to fix. There's still some things that you have to do. Now, what was really amazing is that I was a young rabbi when this transpired. And on one of my trips to Israel, this husband and wife, who I'm close with, but they're not like my brother and sister or anything. They pulled me aside and they shared this with me to get my insight into it, because they know that I had studied Kabbalah and I was very much into it with Rabbi Mordechai Goldstein of blessed memory at Diaspora Yeshiva. And I said, it's a classic. He goes, but how did he know all these things? And I said, I'm also shocked that, you're so frum, you're so orthodox, and your father, I knew your father. And I didn't know that your parents, that he had been originally divorced, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know any of that. He goes, yep, well, we didn't tell anyone. We don't know how he knew. So there you have 3 insights. One, the first insight is that Mukubalim, they see things, they understand things, and there are hidden things in this world that they have the capacity to understand and to see. The second thing is that there's a Gilgul. There's definitely, by the way, one interesting thing, he is named after his grandfather. And that's nothing that they also didn't tell the Mikubal, the Kabbalist, about that. And the third thing is, just because you do the obvious tikkun doesn't mean that you necessarily, once you fix that which was broken or you fulfill that bucket list, that doesn't mean you die. In fact, there are those who explain, now you get rewarded because you've cleaned the slate or you fixed that which is broken. Your vessel is whole. You get to live a more additional years. So that being said, let's do some quick additional verses here. And then maybe we'll finish up.
Rabbi?
Someone's calling me. Yes.
Yes. Rabbi, this person, was he a Kabbalist? Is he a rabbi? Is he somebody that has a degree of in medicine, psychology?
No. He was just a very famous Kabbalist that he actually lived in in the German quarter, the German colony, the area of Jerusalem. He was very famous. I honestly, I could find out. I can contact my loved one, my family one. We're still close, and I'll find out the name of the famous Mikubal, the famous Kabbalist. No, he wasn't a doctor. He was a rabbi. He's actually he had. I guarantee you, he's passed because he was an elderly gentleman 30 years ago when all of this transpired. But his yeshiva still is in existence in the German colony.
But
So
what is of excuse me?
I'll tell you what. Let me finish this page, and then I'll because I like to go. I say an hour, and I have 2 minutes. Let's just do this real quickly. The rectification of a transgression. These are reasons for Gilgulim. A dramatic example is if one had murdered someone, the nefesh of the one that had been killed could end up coming back in it as a Gilgul, as the son or the grandson of the murderer, given life to the soul of the one that he had killed, and all of the effort to raise him would then be the tikkun for having ended his life in a previous existence. Alternatively, if one had stolen from someone and never done teshuva, he and his victim could both return in Gilgulim to give the thief the opportunity to pay the money back or to lend the victim's money and die before it can be repaid. Another is an example of a person reincarnating in order to fill in some mitzvah which he had never done. In this case, the new Gilgul is unlikely to transgress. I gave the example last week about when a child, God forbid, we should never hear the tragedy. When a baby boy does not make it to his bris, the moil is called in, and the moil circumcises the baby that perished, and there's no bracha, there's no ritual other than the flesh is circumcised. Why? Because what happens, as I explained last week, what happened if that child lived a righteous life, but lived in the Soviet Union, in which the moils, pain of death during the 50s and 60s? Or what happens if the baby was born into a family with hemophilia, and you're not allowed to circumcise a child with hemophilia? That person lives a full life, a righteous life, then, however, wants to come back to fulfill that one mitzvah. So he's incarnated into a body. And if you can circumcise the flesh, because it's only a mitzvah of the flesh, that body is now released and doesn't have to go through, another 90 years of trial and tribulation. And lastly, number 4, to guide and rectify others. In this case, the new Gilgul will have some special degree of protection to help him to avoid transgression. So let's say, for example, you rebelled against teachers and you left Judaism. So you reincarnated, you want to come back. What a horrible thing. So that you can become a teacher and guide those because you disrespected teachers. To return in a Gilgul to marry one's soulmate according to their shorsh neshama, their soul root. That's directly from Sha'ar Gilgulim. So I see there's some chats. Let me answer that. Do suicides get reincarnated? And the answer is, when I was a young man, I was a teenager, the Orthodox community here in Miami Beach was very, very strict and very, very, very Orthodox and very, very black and white. And one of the amazing things was in Europe, for example, if you committed suicide, it was a grievous sin. And they would bury you in a special area of a cemetery off to the side, disrespecting you because you committed suicide. Also, in addition to that, in Europe, it was that you weren't allowed to sit shiva for a person who committed suicide. When I was a teenager and I came home from yeshiva, a member of the community committed suicide. And Rabbi Beryl Wine, and you don't get more black hat than Rabbi Beryl Wine, said absolutely not. The person was sick. They were suffering from depression. They battled it, for 25 years. If they died from diabetes, you wouldn't sit shiva. You wouldn't. No, the person had a disease. You have no idea how forward-thinking Rabbi Beryl Wine was in 1975. This was way ahead of the curve. And the family, he was buried in the family plot, and the family sat shiva. So suicide, would be reincarnated if that person regretted their act or, you know, wanted to come back, but it wouldn't be a punishment. It's only when the soul would say, you know, because I suffered, my body suffered from depression and I was off my meds. It was a physical thing. It was a biochemical thing. I want to come back and be reincarnated because I took my life so I can live out a remainder of my life. It's 8:03 and I'm going to give you an example of what other, this is, I was going to share with you, this is actually a mystical script that Rabbi Chaim Vital created so that if any of his notes would ever be stolen, people wouldn't understand. You got to keep it a secret. And this, we're going to talk more about Chaim Vital. We're going to talk about plants being reincarnated into animals, plants, and inanimate objects, how to avoid Gilgul. And this is what we're going to talk about next week is actually, we're going to talk about Dybbuk next week too. Sarita, I think you had, by the way, did you ever see the movie Dybbuk? Made in 1937. It was, you know, an amazing movie. They showed it once at Yeshiva University. And I have to tell you, I don't know why. It scared the bejeebies out of me. I stayed up like 4 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep. And it was scary acting. And one of the Meshulach, the messenger, appears out of nowhere. The girl is acting crazy, and she's possessed by a Dybbuk. And then it's movies in Yiddish with subtitles, and he goes like this: "Es gekommen a Dybbuk." I'll never forget it, which means a Dybbuk has entered into this girl. And it was like, and we were a bunch of 20-year-olds, and like the whole group of us went like, like it was frightening. It was amazing acting. I don't know, it was overplaying. I don't know, but that
was pretty scary the way you said it. Okay.
Thanks, George. Yeah, it was, and it's very dark and ominous, and they had just the right music. It's like Jaws. You remember how scared you are when you saw the movie Jaws or The Exorcist? Okay. So maybe that's, I don't know. All right, Sarita, I think you had a question for me.
Yes, Rabbi. This very wise Kabbalist called this name that you were saying. What does that name mean? How do you call this Kabbalist in Israel?
A mikubal.
What is a mikubal?
It means a Kabbalist. That's what Kabbalah. A mikubal teaches Kabbalah. Or a mikubal is a mikubal mikubal is a specialist in Kabbalah. That's where the origin of the Hebrew word, mikubal. Okay, any more questions for the rabbi? So we had a great session. We had 27 attendees, which are equaled out to about 38 people because we had a lot of doubles. So that was a great class.
Thank you.
And God willing, we'll see you in the morning at Minyan at 8:30, Torah class at 12. And I think Rabbi John, okay, then there's Isha Thursday night classes. We have classes every single day. Just check your email. And we will continue next week with more discussion of the last, we end Gilgul, and we're going to talk about possession. That means when the soul comes back without permission and takes possession of a body. Not only that, but there's also something called ibur, which means a body comes back and cohabits with a soul in one body. So you have two souls in one body. And I had a very interesting discussion this afternoon with my son, the rabbi, Sam. And he goes, you know, we never really studied this at length, but what do you think about, would that explain people LGBTQ issues? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, like people that feel they're women in a male body or male in a female body, or people that feel they're both male and female in a gender specific body. And it's going to open up a lot of windows of discussion because that really would explain a lot, wouldn't it? spiritually.
What about
Also-
people with maybe bipolar, schizophrenic, or things like that? Could that be explained there also?
So when I was in yeshiva, when I was in Daspa Yeshiva, there was 3 members of the student body that suffered from now we call it bipolar. I think then we called it schizophrenia. And when they were on their medications, they were great. They were brilliant. One of them now is a rabbi in diaspora. And when he's medicated, he's great. He's a genius. But back then, and he was about 8, 9 years older than me. And back then, there was this discussion about that. And he was a party to the discussion. And he said, I have an illness. I'm not possessed. And the proof is when I take, I can't remember what it was. Do they take lithium? I'm not possessed. So unless possession is biochemical, he was very aware of his limitations and his illness. And he personally said that his belief was that he was not possessed by a demon. And he actually explained it. He goes, listen, when I'm off my meds and I hear things, it's not, I hear voices in my head, but it's me. It's not, another body, another neshama talking to me. But then he said, but then inanimate objects talk to me. So very interesting, very good insights. And we can discuss that at length also, God willing, next week. And I highly encourage these questions. It gives me ideas of what directions to pursue when I prepare my class next week. Oh, wait, there's another chat question. Forgive me for not seeing it. Thank you all for thanking me. Thank you, guys. Okay, if you want me to, this is like a whole spectrum. And if you want me to specify certain areas, just send me an email with your questions so that over the next week or two, I can direct the session into areas that you find most interesting or areas that you have specific questions about. And I'll be able to find source material to substantiate or validate your concerns or your interests. Okay, that's all. Thank you all for joining class tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Lila
Thank
Tov,
you.
everyone. Lila Tov. I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you,
By the
Rabbi.
way, I think people enjoyed because every week we get the same amount or slightly more. So the word is getting out. So that's a good sign. I hate starting with like 50 people and end up with 3. You know what I mean? It's a bad sign. It's a bad sign. There's more chats. Let me just answer them. Just more thank yous. Stop with the thank yous. Start sending checks, damn it.
The check is in the email.
Someone reminded me of a joke about
I want to hear the
a
joke.
guy from Prague goes to work and they bring a specialist, a lion tamer from Prague to work with the lions in the Metro Zoo. And one day they come back, he was working all night with the 2 lions, and they find his clothing and blood and all over the place and no lion tamer. So they euthanize the lion, and they open her up looking for remains of the lion tamer, and they don't find anything. So the veterinarian goes, the check must be in the mail.
Mail.
Bad joke, but okay, fine.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea how my mind stores useless information, right? Along with the good stuff.
You
All right,
always have a
Yeah.
joke for the moment.
Yeah.
I didn't get it.
Pull it
Who
out.
didn't get it? Who didn't get it? Miriam,
late for
George
you.
didn't get it?
It's too late
Explain
for
it to
him
him.
already.
He's a little slow. Work on it, Miriam.
Check, he's from Prague. That means he's, remember the check is in the male, not in the female. Okay.
If I say,
Okay. Du bist ein bisschen schwach, but not ganz schwach. All right. All right,
Thank you,
Chevra, have a
Rabbi.
good evening, everyone.
Great
Lila
class.
Tov. And I'm
Lila
glad
Tov, thank
everyone
you,
enjoyed
Rabbi.
the class. And welcome to the Weinsteins. Welcome, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good
Bye.
night.
Good night.
Lila
Thank
Tov,
you.
everyone. Lila
Thank you
Tov.
very much.
Mm.
My laptop, Rabbi.
Lila Tov, be well.